On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Omar Turner. He is the Managing Director of Cloud Security at Microsoft. We're going to be talking about data protection and privacy. We're going to be talking about the challenges in it, what you might not even be aware that you don't know, and also what divergence happens from security. I think protection and privacy is a part of security, but also some areas are outside. I think Omar's going to do an awesome job taking us through this. And Omar, can't thank you enough for being on the podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here, Amir.
Awesome. So let's start off at the top. I'm fairly sure everyone knows what Microsoft does, but tell us what your company does. And also, as the Managing Director of Cloud Security, what are some of your responsibilities?
Yeah, no, I would say that hopefully a lot of people know the name Microsoft. We have our hands on a lot of things, mostly everything from Xbox to, cloud services. But I specifically work in a group that its goal is to help organizations realize the value of cloud services and, more importantly, how to make them secure. So that's what I do at a high level. I lead a team of engineers and architects.
Awesome. All right. So topic we're going to be chatting about is data protection and privacy. Before we go further, let's make sure we get a definition of what that means to you and kind of the area we'll be talking about. We'll go from there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people throw the terms data protection and then privacy. It's almost interchangeable, but there's very specific definitions. I think it's very important, especially as an organization develops a program around those initiatives. So data protection is really the tools and the policies, the controls that restrict access to data, right? Whereas data privacy, how do you define who has access and when can they appropriately use it and how can it be shared? So if you think from that perspective, that's how I've always remembered it. And that's how I think organizations really need to define that, because they're different skill sets, different levels of knowledge, and more importantly, different ways of explaining those concepts to different people in an organization.
Absolutely. And I guess if I'm listening and I, look at that, data protection, privacy, and I go, well, that makes sense. It's two different things. And I start thinking about how I might have been treating it as one potentially, or thinking if I'm covered, I'm covered. I guess, what are some of the areas where you just might not be aware that, hey, there's a gap and I should go take a look at some of these particular areas?
Yeah, no, I think from my mind, it's always important to really understand the data that you have, right? I think the challenge a lot of organizations, and in most organizations now, they're data driven. They not only do they collect lots of data, they also potentially share lots of data. So what an organization needs to do is really understand what they have, right? It used to be understanding the assets from like a security perspective, but now from a data perspective, really knowing, again, what the data is, who has access to it. And then you are really understanding the classification levels. You're understanding, what applications have, API pulls into that data. So, that's, I think, ground level. I mean, that's so critical. And you'd be surprised how many organizations struggle with that concept, right? And without knowing where your data is, what the data is, the classification levels, you'll find it very hard to really identify the right controls or actually, identifying the investment on security controls. So that's a very, very important, and we could spend hours talking about how to do that effectively.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess the cloud has introduced wrinkles because it's brought accessibility as well. I mean, you could easily have a department or line manager, install something for their own use, thinking they've made their lives easier, and inadvertently start creating privacy issues because they might have moved a subset of data to do whatever actions they were trying to simplify. I mean, that represents, some kind of growing risk, or at least current risk, probably.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, if you think of the major data breaches, what was an adversary trying to do, right? They're trying to take certain types of data. It could be PHI data, intellectual property, but each of those attacks, there's a very specific purpose. The PHI is just so detrimental, unfortunately. And organizations really needing to understand that they have PHI data. There are various policies or various levels of governance that need to go on top of that. that's essentially, so critical to really understand.
When you're, I guess, seeing the landscape of companies that are, I guess we have companies that are in the cloud, they're using cloud services. They understand some of the risks. Obviously, they might be smaller companies and they're running hard without the thorough understanding of, data protection, privacy. You have larger companies that are moving to the cloud, and for the first time, they're moving things out of their own, data centers, their own networks, and moving to the cloud. I guess when you look at these two different types of, entities, groups of, consumers, I mean, there's similarities, but also there's differences. How do you evaluate, like, I guess when you're looking and talking to a smaller company versus, let's say, the bigger company, they're both going to be in similar situations, but they have completely different angles coming into it?
That's a good question, because I think it's easy to say that a large company has unlimited resources. They know what they're doing. They don't have to worry about anything because they can just buy their way into buying the right controls or the right. We're smaller companies. They're lean. They are just trying to get their product out the door, right? And they'll worry about some of the risks later because they have a profit to generate for their investors, all right? But I think it would do a small company a disservice not to think about things in a certain way, just like it'd be a disservice for a larger organization to assume that they have a handle on it. So the advice I give to a small company and a large company would be very similar. Again, knowing the data that you have and picking a framework, picking NIST and the various versions of NIST that, really help you identify, protect, recover. But there's a privacy framework for that. And, leveraging things that the government has created is a good, way of at least understanding where things need to be in an organization, understanding what the criticality is for how you should approach looking at privacy or looking at data protection. That is something that I would say to both sides organizations. Now, from there, you're looking at, if you're a small organization, how can you enable people to be more aware of, what lines of code that they're developing? They're not, certain, API calls that pull data without verifying the security of that. That should be something that, you think of DevSecOps or other, shift left approaches. That's so important, right? And it all ties into how do you protect your data and making sure that if it gets compromised, you know how to help effectively mitigate against those compromises. I think the challenge of large organizations is that, you get into a point where you have so many stakeholders and, whose function is it in an organization to train and enable and educate business stakeholders of the importance of data protection and data privacy, right? It's not necessarily just a security team. It could be a governance risk compliance team. It could be chief data officer, chief privacy officer. So those large organizations have people and organizations with varying roles to help, but they still have to do it. They still have to meet on a consistent basis with stakeholders, business units, the data owners. Because guess what? Those people know the data better than any of these external organizations will ever know the data. That's one of the things that large organizations can do.
Absolutely. I want to come back to understanding the data, but I had a question to follow on from talking to stakeholders. So if you're going to sit down with stakeholders and you're trying to paint the picture, like sometimes you got to paint that, art of the possible,
right,
what we can do, but then you have to deliver, something short term to keep them going, keep the funding going. How does that look? Like, what would that quick win be? I mean, is there a quick win that a stakeholder, when you're having that stakeholder conversation, you should be, bubbling up?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I mean, I think any conversation I've ever had with a variety of stakeholders in different industries is, can you tell me, I usually ask two questions. What's the worst case scenario if something happens to your data, right? Do you lose funding? Do you lose a marketing partner? Do you lose a business initiative? And also, if you were to map out all the data, what it is and who has access to it, and the bonus question would be, okay, have you ever classified the data? That series of questions would lead me to really understand where they are in their data protection as well as their, data privacy journey, right? Because, in my mind, I'm thinking, yes, you should know what this data is, who can get to it, who should get to it, the various classification levels, where it's stored. And also, if it's stored in certain places, How protected is it? Do you have visibility into any breaches or anything else? So those are a series of questions. And when I've asked that, it's a combination of, yep, we have it, or, oh, that's a good question. Let me find out. Right. So that's all part of the conversation with stakeholders. But again, it's a journey. This, what we do, what organizations do today is just so complex and it's getting harder. But the best thing you can do is just have a good sense of where a majority of your data is.
Absolutely. I guess if there isn't a security function or there's an immature security function, when it comes to going through and starting to classify that data, I mean, it sounds like it could be a challenge, depending on the size of the team. Do you matrix in people to go do that? Does it all fall to the security people? Do you need to bring in outside vendors? How do you typically solve that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a combination of different ways. I mean, I've seen people create custom scripts to connect to AS400 mainframes to really look at what data exists. I've seen people use off-the-shelf tools to scan data and place a rudimentary classification level that will never be 100%, but you're also hoping to get some initial run through of that process to have that verified by stakeholders. It varies, but I think there's a variety of different ways to do it. Some require more resources, more money, but some just takes good old-fashioned just grinding it out, right? And just doing the grunt work of understanding and mapping things out and putting things in spreadsheets. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I've done in the past working with organizations, and that is effective. At the very least, it starts a conversation. Where is this SharePoint directory? Where is this drive? Where is this server that is scheduled to be deployed to the cloud, but it's just not, right? It's in a closet somewhere. Those are the type of things that organizations really need to know. And it's never really just a one and done type of scenario. It's a journey. It's a continuous cycle, continuous feedback loop, and of speaking to different stakeholders and people who own and manage a variety of controls. It's a combined effort, right? And that's a continual process that is so essential to get this right.
Absolutely. I guess, one thing that came to my mind was if you are a large company and let's say you're not, in the cloud fully, you're still going through that digital transformation and you're hoping the cloud solves some of these problems. I mean, is that a fallacy? I mean, does it help create different problems, when we're talking about data protection and privacy?
Yes. I mean, I think the cloud offers more possibilities for the growth of an organization. The digital transformation journey, it is going to be effective mostly in the cloud than a traditional data center. You think of the rapid pace of development, the ability to spin up applications and everything associated with modern development lifecycle. You got to do it in the cloud, but it offers, whatever, thing you have with a great solution like the cloud, there's also, cons, right? So I think the challenge is, you think about the shared responsibility model, your provider will secure the underlying infrastructure. It's up to you to know where you're putting your data and the controls you're putting in the data, right? So you're never, it's not AWS or Microsoft's, or GCP's data problem. It's you, that's your problem. They're just giving you the underlying infrastructure. It is up to the organization that's putting it there to be ultimately responsible for how it's protected and how it's accessed.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. If you live in a gated community, but then you leave your front door open, I mean, it's not solving many of the problems.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess, I think you went through and you talked a little bit about, the challenges and the data side of it, taking inventory. I guess on the privacy side, something that I guess we're reading more in the news, more privacy laws, different states. It's kind of transforming. It's picking up pace. I know Europe's had GDPR for a while, but when you're looking at the landscape and you're looking at how to deal with the ever evolving privacy laws, is it a case where you just we're taking stuff as they come, or can you start forward thinking, I know and anticipate, or is that just undue restrictions based on stuff that you just don't know yet?
No, that's a good question. I think people just have to wait for the one UN data privacy law that encompasses data privacy for every country on the planet, right? No, that's not. I don't know if I don't know if that's ever going to happen. I don't know if that even exists in a Star Trek kind of future. But I think in the near term, what I've seen is organizations having experts, people who really understand privacy and understand the differences between PA and GDPR and the patchwork of not only US states, but, within North America, within, the entire planet, where do you do business mostly, right? Where do you have customers? That's how you have to think about being, open to really understanding the data protection laws that exist and will continue to exist and evolve over the next few years until that magical day where there's just one data privacy law to rule them all. But I guess I don't know if we'll see that in our lifetimes. Fingers crossed, but, because business is international, data is everywhere. Customers are everywhere, especially the larger the company is. So how do you handle that? You have to have tools and capabilities that give you a view of what your policies need to be to align with a GDPR or a CCPA or whatever New York or New Jersey or creates, and be consistent with it, right? So that's a continuous journey.
Definitely, I'm not sure we'll see consensus on that, but it's interesting because even large companies have that broader, where do we work, where do we store data? You could have a startup that just goes viral and their product explodes, and all of a sudden now, a lot of apps are data driven, and all of a sudden they have to start dealing with some of these privacy laws where they probably don't even have the necessary power to even look at it. So it's complicated. It seems like it's not going to get any less complicated moving forward for sure.
Yeah, data sovereignty is such a critical thing for an organization to really understand, where the data resides, data localization. If you don't understand that, you're going to have challenges, right? And that's going to tie into what rules you need to follow from, all the data privacy laws.
Absolutely. We have a little bit more time, but I wanted to ask a question I ask all the leaders that come on the show. And if you could ask a future guest a single question or a topic that you'd like for them to talk about, what would you like to hear about?
Oh, that's a good one. How about the coming capabilities of quantum computing and what we're doing with security and data protection? Because that's coming sooner than we think. If you thought container security was kind of challenging, wait till we have to worry about qubits. So.
Yeah, that's a good one. I might have to listen to that one a couple of times myself because it's going to be a good one. Hopefully I'll find someone to talk to that.
And the reason why I say that, just not to dive in a little deeper,
sure.
You think of a future of a advanced adversary. They go to an organization. This organization is so mature. Their data encryption methodology is top notch. Grabbing that data and not being able to encrypt it now, but waiting for the right technology to come along, right? With the quantum capability, that is a future nightmare scenario. So hopefully your next guest could answer that.
That would be a good episode. I'm going to hopefully hear somebody who can do that. If somebody wants to reach out to you to talk about anything you mentioned on the podcast, or just pick your brain on anything security, what's a good way of getting a hold of you?
I would just say LinkedIn. You could probably shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Always happy to chat, talk about security. Another thing I do is help people get involved in the security career path, because that is something we're going to need more people to do. There's such a talent gap compared to the job openings. That's very, very important to me. So happy to talk about that as well, in addition to data and cloud security.
Awesome. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being on.
Great to be here. Thank you again.
Awesome. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, if you know anything to the topic Omar mentioned about quantum computing and the implications of security, let me know. I'd love to have you on. Or if you know someone, let me know who that is and put me in touch with them. And otherwise, if you've enjoyed the podcast, it's been something that you like, share it with somebody else that might. That's how we've been growing. I appreciate that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.